I'll be presenting on binaries in art theory and aesthetic philosophy tonight. I'm interested in how mutually exclusive ideas ultimately cross-pollinate, and in the debate between them, they end up sharing, and often that binary becomes membranous or dissolves entirely. I'm really connected to this topic because I'm planning to pursue an individualized major that combines graphic design, painting, and visual studies. And in responding to the criticisms, I heard of this idea of the notion of these disciplines being really hermetic. It caused me to deeply reflect on the structures and binaries of the art world that have ultimately ended up becoming membranous or cross-pollinating. So I am interested in the structure of the art world and its many absurdities and binaries. I think one of the ways that we're seeing this in contemporary practice is the dissolution of the art and design binary, especially in the space of art education, but also in practice. Most recently, there's some really interesting examples of art and design hybridity in Take This Hammer at the YBCA. Furthermore, I think that the renewed interest in academic depiction in contemporary art, kind of mocking and criticizing the modernist rejection of academic art and kind of reflecting on how academic a lot of contemporary and modern art has become is very interesting. So the binaries that I'll be examining tonight are artifice versus essence, reflecting on Plato and Aristotle's theories of mimesis, form versus content, reflecting on Clive Bell's theory of formalism and critical reactions to Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle's The Uninvited series, specifically looking at the sower. And I'll be taking a look at the universal versus the variable, thinking about Heidegger and Dewey's theories as exemplified by Flag by Jasper Johns. So first of all, reflecting on mimesis, Plato and Aristotle have a similarly rationalist, positivist way of looking at things, and they want that to be represented in art and in depiction. Specifically, Plato almost has kind of a censorship for what he feels should be depicted, only that which is good and rational and so forth. To refresh your memory on his theories, I'll be doing a brief reading from page 29. Plato writes, "But when this part, after frequent measuring, informs us that one thing is greater than or lesser than or equal to another thing, it is contradicted at the same moment by the appearance which the same things present. Yes, did we not assert the impossibility of entertaining at the same time and with the same part of us contradictory opinions with reference to the same things? Yes, and we were right in asserting it. When then that part of the soul whose opinion runs counter to the measurements cannot be identical with the part that agrees with them? Certainly not. But surely that which trusts measurement and calculation must be the best part of the soul. Doubtless it must. Hence, that which contradicts this part must be one of the inferior elements of our nature, necessarily so. So Plato was talking about his value of these rationalist, positivist measurements as opposed to the irrational nature of artistic depiction. Aristotle has a somewhat more nuanced theory. I'll be reading from page 50 on two of his points on discovery, point 1 and point 6. Points 1 through 6 kind of build up in Aristotle's thoughts on their value. So starting with point 1, he writes, as for the species of discovery, the first to be noted, 1, the least artistic form of it, of which poets make use through mere lack of invention, discovery by signs and marks. So there he's talking very directly and delineating very directly the difference between essence and artifice. Moving to point 6, he writes, the best of all discoveries, however, is that arising from incidents themselves, when the great surprise comes about through a probable incident like that in Oedipuus of Sophocles and Iphigenia. For it was not improbable that she should wish to have a letter taken home. These last are the only discoveries independent of the artifice of signs and necklaces. Next after them come discoveries through reasoning. So you're seeing a value of reasoning, measuring, and positivism in both of these. There are some interesting philosophical issues with these dualisms. The first I immediately reflect on is kind of the contemporary science and philosophy of science that has caused us to be more distrustful of positivist measuring, and whether these kinds of rational scientific measurements that Plato and Aristotle are talking about actually capture more artifice than essence. The more aesthetic issues, the more aesthetic ironies, is that truth and non-emotion are incompatible because emotionality is a very present reality. So I would argue that any attempt to abstract the emotionality from that which is depicted is a form of abstraction and in itself the construction of another artifice. Furthermore, the representations and the represented form a very interesting feedback loop. First of all, I would consider the very contemporary idea and the very contemporary issue in scholarship of the post-internet, wherein digital ephemera is made material. Media art initially brought up this issue and its own issues of ephemerality, even going back to Cubism and early modernism, thinking about the ephemerality of media. As the internet and mobile devices have proliferated, ephemera has become even more ephemeral, and so by materializing these ephemeral trends, they make us even more aware of how quickly things go out of date. This has been a very interesting occurrence in the museum setting, and as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of interesting examples in the Take This Hammer show at the YBCA. But I don't think this kind of feedback loop is at all a new thing. I would think back to Christendom and the Renaissance in the times of the Protestant Reformation, wherein doctrine, artistic production, lifestyle, doctrine, and doctrine formed a feedback loop. So this interest in producing very lavish cathedrals, which was really expensive, kind of evolved into the lavish lifestyle of the clergy, and the money to support that came from multiple initiatives. The most inflammatory initiative being the doctrine of indulgences, hence the Protestant Revolution. So I think you can see a feedback loop between the representation of doctrine in that architecture and in that artistic production, which ultimately came all the way back to doctrine. So these value systems of antiquity set the stage for Renaissance and ultimately the reaction against that in modern art. So we have some interesting dualisms in art theory coming up throughout modernism. Structuralism versus post-structuralism, the institution versus the individual, intention versus improvisation, the mechanical versus the natural, so on and so forth, in the point-counterpoint structure that one becomes very familiar with studying modern art. Also, these issues are embodied in modern art schools and movements, such as neoclassicism versus romanticism, impressionism versus cubism, futurism versus Dada, minimalism versus conceptualism, gesturalism versus pop. Again and again, the point-counterpoint structure of modernism continuously reiterates itself. We also see this interest in breaking down binaries in contemporary politics. For example, the interest in fluid queer identities and diasporic racial identities is really transforming the nature of these issues. The work of art that we've been taking a look at on the slide once again is One in Three Chairs by Joseph Kosuth that was made in 1965, shown in MoMA, and reflects on the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. Interestingly, this conceptual work of art brings us to our next example, which is a very interesting counterpoint to conceptualism. This is, again, Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle's The Sower, made in 2014. It looks very big, projected, but it is, in fact, 11 by 14, so a relatively small painting. And it really collapses the form-content divide, which is embodied in so many modern art schools and movements. Her interest in delivering information through process and through materiality is very interesting. So she's breaking down that concept process binary, also a function and beauty binary, In fact, the brochure text and a lot of the wall text describes these works of art as social tools. Also, she's seeking to educate. So these are all not only functional, but they are informational. So who would we find that would be so antithetical to these ideas? Of course, Clive Bell. I will be doing a brief reading from page 264. Bell writes, "The hypothesis that significant form is the essential quality of the work of art has at least one merit denied to many more famous and more striking. It does help explain things. We are all familiar with pictures and pictures that interest us and excite our admiration, but do not move us as works of art. To this class belongs what I call descriptive painting, that is, painting in which forms are used not as objects of emotion, but as means of suggesting emotion and conveying information. Portraits of psychological and historical value, topographical works, pictures that tell stories and suggest situations, illustrations of all sorts belong to this class. That we might recognize the distinction is clear, for who has not said that such and such a drawing was an excellent illustration, but as a work of art worthless. Of course, many descriptive pictures possess, among other qualities, formal significance and are therefore works of art, but many do not. They interest us and they move us to 100 different ways, but they do not move us aesthetically. According to my hypothesis, they are not works of art. They leave untouched the aesthetic emotions, because it is not their forms, but their ideas or information conveyed by their forms that affect us." He also has some thoughts on what will replace this very terrible descriptive painting. He says on the next page, "For an account of manners and fashions we shall go in the future to photographs, supported by a little bright journalism, rather than to a descriptive painting." So I think you can see right off the bat how Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle's The Sower is antithetical to that in so many ways. Before I dive into those philosophical issues, I'll be doing a more contemporary reading that is really pulling off of Bell's theories. I'm going to be reading from Paragraphs on Conceptual Art by Saul LeWitt in 1967, so jumping a good ways forward in art history, but a lot of these ideas are persistent. There are some subtle differences, and we'll examine those further. So taking out a few brief excerpts from this text, LeWitt writes, LeWitt writes of contemporary art, that is, "All of the planning and decisions are made beforehand, and execution is a perfunctory affair. The idea becomes a machine that makes the art. This kind of art is not theoretical or illustrative of theories. It is intuitive. It is involved with all types of mental processes, and it is purposeless. It is usually free from the dependence on the skill of the artist as a craftsman." Moving further in text, "Some artists confuse new materials with new ideas. There is nothing worse than seeing art that wallows in gaudy baubles. By and large, most of the artists who are attracted to these materials are the ones who lack the stringency of mind that would be able to use the materials well." Moving further in the text, the final excerpt from the text. "Anything that calls attention to and interests the viewer in the physicality is a deterrent to our understanding of the idea, and is used as an expressive device." So we see some interesting similarities in the text in that both of them seem to have a problem with materiality. There's some very kind of hazy, ambiguous ideas about depiction. Saul LeWitt saying that the idea is not necessarily described in the conceptual artwork, and so it's kind of ambiguous about how Clive Bell might feel about contemporary art, but we can't really answer that because of the big time gap in history. it's really interesting, that second excerpt from Clive Bell, which speaks about how we will replace descriptive painting in the future, celebrates photography and journalism. These processes of Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle really challenge that. They challenge the journalistic value of photography. To shed some more light on that, I'll be doing a brief reading from the introduction to the show from the Museum of the African Diaspora's website. The excerpts include: Hinkle presents her work as a tool to undo the imaginings placed on the colonized body and its movements through space and time. Hinkle's works remixes and reimagines these perceptions and seeks to invent new possibilities of engaging visually with the black female body respectfully. Concerned with the historical present, Hinkle's research-based studio practice is a collision of mediums. Hinkle's work with West African colonial-era photography, the story of Tituba and the Black Witch of Salem, and her interest in the contested geography named Kent-Africa, creates a dynamic push and pull between past, present, and future, in which she oscillates between the real and the imagined, collapsing the two into an elusive space of time and being. So, these pieces are very much rooted in the post-structural, non-binary global thought that this presentation is addressing. So we see how Hinkle really addresses these conventional ideals about photography as journalism. She is holding up these colonial-era photographies as false and as absurd, and she's recontextualizing them. Process is very, very important in delivering the information and making them into a tool. I'm sure Clive Bell and Solowit would have an issue with art as a tool and art as education. So the process delivers information, not only the pictorial look, the imagery. It is the way in which these are made that's very significant to the content that's being delivered. We can see that she is literally cutting into the colonial photograph. I think that's very significant to have it almost an act of vandalism on these photographs that really holds them up for our criticality. And shows us their absurdity. We can see that she eliminates the horizon line. Horizon line is very important to give us viewing angle, and viewing angle in colonial photography is very important. Often it's a downward view, not so much in this particular photograph, but eliminating that horizon line is very significant. In the photograph she uses, there typically is a sexual corporeal exposure in these depictions of women, and so she's using the processes of collage and of drawing to reclothe and desexualize these women. In the process of cutting this paper and literally laying them over, she is reclothing the photographs. So again, there's a lot of significance in that material process. So in all of these, this really culminates in subverting, in a very postmodern way, subverting systems of meaning, subverting the language of photography, subverting the language of colonialism through these processes of masking and gluing and reshuffling and painting and colliding multiple media. So this really directly challenges Bell's theories and Solowit's theories. Moving on to a third distinctly postmodern work of art. This is Flag by Jasper Johns. And through this image, I will be examining the universal versus the idiosyncratic, or the variable, as it says here. So Heidegger says that a great work of art can define the meaning of being for an entire people. However, what Johns produces here is really something that allows us to interpret the meaning of being American in a very personal way. I'll be doing a brief reading from Heidegger's theory on page 356 in the anthology. He writes, but this simple thrusting is not, but this multiple thrusting is nothing violent, for the more purely the work itself is transported into the openness of beings, an openness opened by itself, the more simply does it transport us into this openness, and thus at the same time transport us out of the realm of the ordinary. To submit to this displacement means to transform our accustomed ties to the world and the earth, and henceforth to restrain all the usual doing and prizing and knowing and looking in order to stay within the truth that is happening in the work. The next excerpt says, in the work, the happening of truth is at work, and indeed at work according to the manner of work. Accordingly, the nature of art was defined to begin with as the setting into work of truth. Yet this definition is intentionally ambiguous. It says, on the one hand, art is fixing in place of a self-establishing truth in the figure. This happens in creation as in the bringing forth of the unconcealedness of what is. Setting into work, however, also means the bringing of the work being into movement and happening. This happens as preservation. Thus, art is the creative preserving of truth in the work. Art, then, is the becoming and happening of truth. The third excerpt says, art lets truth originate. Art founding, preserving is the spring that leaps to the truth of what is in the work. To originate something by a leap, to bring something into being from out of source of its nature in a founding leap. This is what the word origin literally means. So how does this relate to flag? In other parts of the text, Heidegger states that the work of art is a tension between earth and world. And so I think that this issue of Americanness and American identity is really related to that. What is the American world as opposed to the earth of a literal nation state of America versus this world of American identity. There's an interesting YouTube dialogue video. You may be familiar with the Smart History series. And this is a couple of short excerpts from the dialogue between an art historian and Khan of Khan Academy in relation to flag. The art historian says, and I think he wanted this painting to function as something that did raise all kinds of meanings in the person who walked up to it. In a sense, what he's showing us is not so much a flag as a mirror, because it is such a potent symbol. And when we walk up to it with a lot of personal life experience, and it can mean very different things to very many different people, and in a sense, he's given us a very neutral field. Khan says later in the video, I mean, this one really speaks to me because especially the texture and the fact that it is not printed. It is handmade and there are those layers on it. It's a very powerful idea. When you just have a printed flag, it simplifies what the country is, or what the ideas country represents are in its history. When you look at this painting, yes, it's an American flag, but you appreciate, look, America is a But when you look at the ways that a country represents in its history, and when you look at a painting, yes, it's an American flag, but you appreciate its history. And when you look at a painting, yes, it's an American flag, but you appreciate, look, America. There's a context to America. There's a history to America. There's a depth to America. There's a texture to America. You look closer at America, and it is not this simple idea. There are many, many, many layers to it, and I think this really does a good job. So pointing very directly to what Heidegger is talking about, a world worlding. The world of America is worlding, truth being set to work. Kind of a very personal psychological investigation of what is a personal experience of America. Now, there's quite an irony to this because Heidegger believes that a great work of art defines the meaning of being for an entire people, As the transcript stated, what Johns is doing here is he's not writing a dictionary definition of what it means to be American in a very opaque way. He's actually setting up a mirror so that we can reflect on that. To kind of dial back that thesis, I think there is a universality in what Johns is saying. It's a universality of ambivalence and of idiosyncrasy, which is in itself kind of mutually exclusive and self-contradictory. How can he categorically define? How can Johns categorically define the meaning of being as ambivalence and contradiction? That's inherently not categorical. So there's somewhat of a mutually exclusivity in that, kind of a logical impossibility to that, but it is an interesting point to consider. Dewey's theory gives us a bit more of a substantive way to understand this in his theory of art as the growth experience, especially art as an exceptional experience. This painting absorbs the meaning from the everyday flag. The flag is something that we see so often, and we absorb meaning from it in a very subtle way. This painting causes us to reflect on all the meaning that we've been absorbing in the past, but also it projects into the future. You can't look at an American flag the same way after you see this painting. This painting continues to project all of that information onto the printed and banal flags that one sees every day. For a quick summary of art as an exceptional experience, I'll turn to page 269 in the anthology. .296 rather, excuse me. Dewey writes, art is remitted to a separate realm where it is he's speaking of this as an unfortunate occurrence. Art is remitted to a separate realm where it's cut off from association with the materials and aims of every other form of human effort, undergoing and achievement. A primary task is thus imposed on one who undertakes to write upon the philosophy of fine arts. This task is to restore the continuity between the refined and intensified forms of experience that are works of art and the everyday events, doings, and sufferings that are universally recognized to constitute experience. So I think Johns is very directly relating that to Dewey's theories. There's an interesting meta element to this in that John Dewey is so interested in the idea of democracy and egalitarianism, which we hold to be fundamentally American, and Jasper Johns is also reflecting on that, which is fundamentally American. Dewey also talks about the construction of meaning and an active looking experience. That's on page 314. He writes, perception is an act in the outgoing of energy in order to receive, not a withholding of energy. To steep ourselves in subject matter, we have to first plunge into it. When we are only passive to a scene, it overwhelms us, and for lack of answering activity, we do not perceive that which bears us down. We must summon the energy and pitch it at a responsive key in order to take it in. For to perceive a beholder, this is skipping forward in the text, for to perceive a beholder must create his own experience, and his creation must include relations comparable to that in the original producer underwent. They are not the same in any literal sense, but with the perceiver, as with the artist, there must be an ordering of the elements of the whole in a form, although not in details, the same as the processes of organization the creator of the work consciously experienced. Without an act of recreation, the object is not perceived as a work of art. The artist selected, simplified, clarified, abridged, and condensed according to his interest. The beholder must go through these operations according to his point of view and interest. In both, the act of abstraction, that is, the extraction of what is significant, takes place. In both, there is comprehension in this literal signification, that is, gathering together the details and particulars of physically scattered into an experienced whole. The work is done on the part of the percipient, as there is on the work of the artist. So this is certainly an active and introspective viewing experience in flag, in which the viewer creates his own meaning. So there is somewhat of a tension between Dewey and Heidegger's analyses, as I mentioned before, as they apply to flag. Heidegger seeking a very fundamental meaning of being for everyone in a country, and Dewey allowing for this kind of active, idiosyncratic, reflective experience. The tension between that is really wrapped up in Jasper Johns' flags. Very interestingly, the under collage of Jasper Johns' flag is newspaper clippings, and so he's reflecting on the tensions of his time in the 50s and 60s and the divisions that America was experiencing. So it's a very interesting second conceptual layer to consider. Thank you.